Okay, Parsha Chayei Sarah. So the Parsha is called Chayei Sarah, which means the life of Sarah. And so the Pasuk continues, it says, and the life of Sarah was, and it says 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. So we're going to quote a Midrash on this Pasuk, and the Midrash says that about Sarah that so let's read start from the top inside and we'll see how we go. So al pasuk regarding the pasuk Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah and the life of Sarah was, it says Vayihiyu and were because the Hebrew word for life is plural. Maybe the Medrash quotes the pasuk Yodeya Hashem Yemei Timimim. There's a pasuk in Tehillim, a verse in Tehillim in Psalms that says Hashem knows the days of the complete. Probably a good way to translate Timimim-ish. And the Medrash explains that Kashem Shehain, just like they, righteous people, are complete, Kach Shnosam Timimim, so too their years are complete. And the Medrash brings this from Sarah, or quotes Sarah as the sort of the primary example of this, that a righteous person who, just like she was complete, her years were complete. Now, there are a few things that we got to figure out here because, well, first of all, why does the Medrash choose Sarah as an example of all? Like, there are plenty of righteous people, plenty of tzaddikim, plenty of tzaddikuyos to choose from. What is it specifically about Sarah? And the question's not like it shouldn't have chosen Sarah, it should have chosen someone else. The question is just, okay, the Medrash chose Sarah. Why? Why was she the choice among all the options? Now we're going to skip over a couple of paragraphs. And jump to, okay, so the next couple bits I'm going to talk about outside. It's basically the second column on page 25 in Hebrew. So two more things that we need to clarify. First of all, yes, right here, you can have as many as you want. I'm assuming one will do. So first of all, when it says that the tzaddikim, the righteous people, shehem tamimim, that they are complete, what does it mean? I mean, it seems that it says that just like they are complete, what complete is referring to is not the Torah and mitzvahs, just their observance of Torah and mitzvahs, because we already labeled them as tzaddikim. We've already made it clear that we're referring to tzaddikim, to righteous people. So why does it need to say kashem shehem tamimim, just like they are complete? If it feels the need to add that, that means that the completeness that we're talking about is something other than just their record of Torah and mitzvahs, because we've already covered that by referring to them or labeling them as tzaddikim. And also, once we understand what it means that they are complete, we're going to understand the connection between the fact that they are complete. And when it says shnosam tamimim, their days are complete, what it means generally is that they end up living the full amount of time that's allotted to them, as opposed to passing away before their originally designated time. So just like Sarah was a complete as a person, Tomim, so too her years were complete and she lived out her completely allotted time. Question is, what's the connection between the two, right? It's not, with Torah, it's reward and punishment isn't just, it's not childish. There's always a connection. It's not random. It's not arbitrary. So if the outcome of living a complete life, whatever that means, and we're going to discuss what that means, is that her years are complete and she lives out her fully originally allotted amount of time in this world. Why? The question is why? What's the connection? Now, in terms of the wording and the phraseology, it works really nicely. It sounds nice. Just like she is complete, so too her days are complete. That works. but we have to understand what it means that she was complete, other than just being a tzaddikus, because it must mean something else, because we already know she was a tzaddikus. Number two is that once we understand what it means that she was complete, we will hopefully then understand what the connection is, or why living out her previously allotted amount of time in the world fully is related naturally to living a complete life. Because if the outcome of living a complete life is living out the originally allotted amount of time fully, there has to be a connection between them. It's not just arbitrary. Okay. So we're going to jump to base now, halfway down the right column on page 26 in the Hebrew. In the English, it should be called like 2 or B, something like that. Okay, so page 49. It's just a paragraph that begins. The title, the subtitle is Advanced Age Abraham's Greatness. Okay, so in the Hebrew, we're on base, halfway down right column, page 26. But Parsha Zo Amar Medrash, on this Parsha, the Medrash says, Al HaPasuk Vavram Zaken Bar Bayomim. So the Pasuk says, Vavram Zaken, and Avram was old, Bar Bayomim, coming in days. So the Medrash says, Yesh Lacha Adam Shehu Bezikna Ve'ena B'Yomim, B'Yomim Ve'ena Bezikna, Aval Kan Zikna Keneged Yomim Ve'Yomim Keneged Zikna. So the Medrash is addressing, why does the Pasuk seems to be repetitive? It says, Avram was old, coming of days. So why does it repeat itself? It seems to be redundant. And we know that a pasuk is never redundant. The Torah never says additional words unnecessarily if there's no specific reason why we need to hear them. So the Midrash says it's talking about two different things. There's zikna, and then there's bar bayomim. Zikna would be, I guess the most precise translation would be oldness, which we think of as being age, but perhaps not necessarily. And then there's Bar Bayomim, coming of days, which would be actually how long a person's been alive. And so the Medrash says there are people who are, old in personality, just take a step back. Why is it, a lot of times people will say, if you have some issue, you need to figure it out, go speak to someone older. Speak to someone older. Older people have lived longer, and all things being equal, any given person will have more wisdom later in their life than they will earlier. So oldness refers to a person's characteristics. It could be the way they look. It could be their maturity level. It could be their wisdom, etc. And then Bar Bayomim is actually like how long they've been alive. And there are some people who are, old in character, wise, mature, etc., but haven't been around for that long. And there are people who've been around for a long time and are not that wise and mature. And Avram had both. Avram had both Zoken and Bar Bayomim. So that's kind of the basic surface level of the Medrash. It was telling us that, so he had his oldness connected the amount of time, appropriate for the amount of time he lived, and the amount of time he lived that was appropriate for his oldness, age, wisdom. So he had both. He had both the wisdom and the actual and actual longevity in terms of time. But there's going to have to be more in terms of what this is talking about with Avram Avinu. Like he lived a lot of days, and what does that tell us about him? That's no praise for someone. They happen to live a long time. That's Hashem's call, not theirs. So in the Pasuk's telling us, the verse is telling us about the virtue of Avram, and it says he was old and coming of days. There's going to be more to this picture of what it's referring to. There has to be another deeper layer of what this Midrash is getting at. So there's an expression, Chazal, that the sages say that the word Zokein, which literally means old, means Zeh Shekana Chachma, one who has acquired knowledge, one who has acquired wisdom, and specifically Torah knowledge, Torah wisdom. So And it says, Mipnei Seva Tokum, you should stand up before someone who is old. Halachically, one is required both to stand up for a person who's older and Zeshekon Chachma, someone who is older in terms of their Torah knowledge. So someone who's a Torah scholar, because Zokein, oldness, can refer to Zeshekon Chachma, one who has acquired Torah. So we're halachically obligated to stand up for older people, regardless of scholarship or lack thereof. And we also have to stand up for people who are old, who are senior in terms of their Torah scholarship. So it applies to both. Neither one takes away from the other. When we say that Zaken means Zeshekon Chachma, old means one who has acquired Torah wisdom, it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to old, like literally old people. It means doesn't take away from that. We're adding this to it. So Avraham Zaken, Avraham Zeshekon Chachma, Avraham had acquired an extraordinary amount of Torah knowledge, of spiritual awareness, divine awareness. And in addition to that, he was also Ba Bayomim. So we're going to actually translate this a little more literally. That when we say that Ba Bayomim, he was coming in days, because coming in days is, first of all, translating to from Hebrew to English often creates some issues, but it's maybe a little bit poetic, it's a little bit non-literal, but if we translate those words actually literal, Ba Bayomim literally means coming in the days. And what it means is that Avram Avinu filled every single one of his days with mitzvahs. Avram Avinu didn't have any empty days that he had not filled with mitzvahs. Ba Bayomim, he came into every single one of his days. He entered into those days. He was present in every single one of the days that he lived, and he filled every one of those days with mitzvahs. So now what we have is Avram Zaken Ba Bayomim. Avram Zaken had acquired Torah knowledge, wisdom, divine and spiritual awareness, and Ba Bayomim, he had filled his days with mitzvahs. So now, I'm going to jump to the top of Gimel. One sec, we've already done. So let's talk a little about some differences between Zaken and Ba Bayomim. Zaken, again, being acquisition of Torah, and Ba Bayomim being filling days with mitzvahs. So there are really a couple of very big differences here. Right? Torah, study, learning, is relatively intangible. Right? Give me 1 second. Just realized I'm going to share this on Facebook a little further to give it a bit more reach. So there. That's going to be meta. Okay, so Torah is information. It's ideas, it's concepts. It's not so tangible. Mitzvahs generally, and also what is Torah specifically? Torah specifically is not just information. It's not just wisdom, it's Hashem's wisdom, it's Hashem's knowledge, it's divine information. So it's both intangible and divine in nature. Mitzvahs are the opposite. Mitzvahs are generally, mitzvahs as a rule involve objects, involve things in the world. Mitzvahs tend to be associated with very tangible things. And let's leave it at that. Mitzvahs are associated with objects, with parts of the world, with very physical, tangible, lighting Shabbos candles is like a wick and wax or paraffin or oil. Putting on tefillin is physical leather, physical parchment, wearing tzitzis, you name it. Mitzvahs tend primarily to be related to the very tangible. And another thing here is the direction. So the direction of Torah study, what happens is we are taking divine knowledge, information, and introducing it into our minds, into our brains, into our souls, into our experience. So Torah study, which is Zaken, Zeh Shekana Chachma, the direction is inward, it's in towards us. The direction of mitzvahs is the opposite. When we do mitzvahs, what we're doing is we are acting on the world. The direction is out from us into the world. So we have two sort of opposite trends here between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah is non-tangible, spiritual, and inward directed. So it's us taking non-tangible spiritual information, bringing it into ourselves. Mitzvahs is us moving out into the world, acting on the world with generally very tangible objects, tangible things. I could try. So Torah is us introducing divine knowledge into ourselves, and mitzvahs is us acting on the world with very material, tangible objects. So the two distinctions are Torah is associated with the intangible, whereas mitzvahs are strongly focused around the tangible, and Torah is inward directed and mitzvahs are outward directed. Excellent, thank you. So, when we, this is going to be really very, very fundamental. And this is all going to come back to Sarah, because Avram and Sarah were a team. And the theme, right, in Kabbalah, it talks a lot about the themes of Avram versus Yitzchak versus Yaakov. Each one had sort of their own, unique character and personality and theme. And the theme of Avram was a common theme for Avram and Sarah together. They were a team. And so this idea that we're focusing on is something that's addressed in this medrash in the context of Avram. And then when we extrapolate that back and relate it back to Sarah, it's going to answer all the questions we had at the beginning. So generally speaking in life, right? Different people have different personalities. We gravitate towards different things. We have different interests. We have different taste in food. We have different taste in music. We have different interests in terms of hobbies. Some people are, introverted. Some people are extroverted. Most people are somewhere on the spectrum between the two extremes, as some are more towards one side, some are more towards the other side. Some people some people, like to spend a lot of time by themselves. Some people like to spend a lot of time with others. Some people are more focused on, the deeper parts of people, and some people are more focused on the outer parts of people. Some people like to think, learn, listen, and some people like to be active and to get things done and make things happen. Now, with all of these different traits that we've talked about, none of them is a question of better versus worse or more good versus less good. It's different. Now, that's not to say I'm not like whitewashing the fact that there is good and bad in life and there is, better and less good. Of course, these things exist, but none of these traits is inherently, better, more or less good. It's a question of what any of these traits are applied to. Now, when it comes to living a Torah mitzvahs life, just in terms of our personalities, there are going to be some people whose primary focus is on Torah study, on learning, on introducing divinity and the abstract into themselves and their souls. And there are going to be people whose primary focus is more on doing mitzvahs, on getting out there, doing things, making things happen. action. And they're both important, and we need both of them. Now, because naturally we tend as people to follow the path of least resistance. Everything in the world does. It's true in physics, and it's true in chemistry, and it's true in personalities of people. We tend naturally towards the path of least resistance, which means if we have two options and one option is just going to be easy and smoother, naturally that will be the one that we will tend to choose unless we intentionally choose otherwise. It's a big part of how habits form, etc. Of why habits form, I should say. So, people who are introverted will generally naturally tend to do things at home, to read, to do things themselves, maybe with a really close friend that they're very comfortable with and they don't feel like they have to go out much and to interact with them. And a person who's extroverted will naturally tend to go out, to interact with people, to find places where there are people and where there are people to interact with and to talk to and to etc. Now, a person who's introverted might say to themselves, you know what, yes, this is my comfort zone. This is what's easy for me. This is my path of least resistance. But you know what, there's getting out there and interacting with people in a way that doesn't come to me naturally also has a lot to offer my life. So maybe I'll make an effort to go out and to meet people, even though it's uncomfortable and I don't enjoy it. And maybe I'll get a little better at it, and maybe I won't. But either way, if it has something to offer my life, maybe it's worth following a path with a little more resistance, right? And vice versa. But naturally, we tend to gravitate towards the path of least resistance, which means that naturally, unless we're intentionally doing otherwise, we will tend towards the behaviors that match our personalities most closely. And when it comes to Torah mitzvahs, this is going to be the same thing. It's going to be equally true. There are some people, being academic and versus being an active person are definitely two different categories of personalities. It's not to say that you have to be either or. There are plenty of people who are a mixture, but it's not uncommon that there are people who naturally are just interested in learning and being involved in academic pursuits and activities. And there are people who just have no interest in that and just want to be out there getting things done and making things happen, which means they will. Now, if we take those personalities and apply them to the life of a Torah Jew, there will be people who are naturally going to spend every spare minute sitting and learning Torah. And there are going to be people who are naturally spending every minute trying to find another mitzvah to do, trying to find another person to help, etc. Now, the ultimate ideal is going to be a combination of the two. And we're going to take a step back and talk about, what we're doing here. Why are we here? Why is the world here? Why does the world exist? So the purpose, or a purpose of creation, I should say, because there are a number of different ones that are described. A purpose of creation is bring the union of physical and spiritual, right? Spirituality doesn't physically exist. Spirituality isn't made out of protons and electrons and neutrons. It's not made out of mass, physical mass and energy. If you ask, do angels exist? If what you mean by exist is physically exist, the answer is no, they're not physical objects. They're not physical entities. It doesn't make them any less real. We just need to appreciate and understand that which exists spiritually and not physically is equally as real as that which exists physically and not spiritually. They're different layers of reality, different parameters that define the existence, but they're both equally true. And they cannot naturally interact with each other. We have the ability to bring them together. Did I very recently talk about the metaphor of the interpreter? No? It's hard for me to keep track because I teach so many classes and they're all very similar. So I teach 15 classes a week that are all similar. So it's hard for me to keep track of when I said something to know where I said it. So, let's say, for example, very simple, you have, look, I used to use the metaphor of a courtroom, but let's do something a little bit friendlier. right? We're having some international business here, some international trade, and there's an American company and a Vietnamese company, and they want to do business together. Problem is that the people in the American company don't speak Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese people don't speak English. What do? Very simple. You get someone who speaks both languages, and bingo, that person can now facilitate communication between the two languages. Very easy. They understand both languages, they can speak both languages, we now have communication, and these two companies can now do business because they can communicate. So if physical and spiritual are mutually exclusive, and what exists spiritually does not exist physically, and what exists physically does not exist spiritually, how can the two come together? The purpose of creation, of existence, is the union of physical and spiritual, but they're mutually exclusive. The answer is we need to find something which has a foot in both, something which speaks both languages that can then bring the two together, that's going to act, as the metaphoric interpreter. And that is us. Every one of us has a body, which means that we can act on the world, we can interact with the physical world. And every one of us has a soul, which means that we naturally interact with that which is spiritual and divine. Does anyone have a question about this at this point? Right. The question is, the question that we had is, how is it that the physical and spiritual can interact if they're mutually exclusive? The answer is that we are a combination of the two, so we can facilitate the interaction between the two. How could we be a combination of the two? How can a body and a soul partner together if the body is non-spiritual and the soul is non-physical? And as far as the reality of the soul is concerned, the body doesn't exist. And as far as the reality of the body is concerned, the soul doesn't exist. So how does that work? And the answer is it actually shouldn't work. It's unnatural. And this is why we say in the bracha Asher Yotzar that we say, it's part of the morning blessings. And then we also say it after using the restroom. We thank God for our health. And at the end of the bracha, the bracha concludes, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed is God, Roifei chol basar, who heals all flesh, mafli la'asos, and does wonders. Now, the simple literal face value meaning of the fact that Hashem does wonders is that for life itself to exist, if we stop and think about how many things have to work together with unimaginable precision, in perfect balance, perfectly timed, everything together for life to exist at all, it actually statistically doesn't make sense that life should exist. And that's life at all. Then you take a person who's, an individual organism made out of trillions of different cells. And every cell, we think of cells, in high school, you might look at a cell under a light microscope and you see a cell and you can see the nucleus and the cell wall, cell membrane, whatever it is. It's in a plant, you'll see a cell wall as well. And that's about what you see. It's like, oh, okay, this is a cell. If you look at a cell at higher magnification, a cell itself is an entire universe. There's countless different organelles inside a cell doing different things. A cell is like a factory with different pieces of equipment and different departments and different things happening. And there's communication and transport between. A cell literally has physical, mechanical, chemical transport systems that move things from one part of the cell to the other so that can undergo different processes and get made and then get processed and get used. A cell is like a whole universe. That's just one cell. And our body is made out of trillions of those cells. And within any one cell, there are, I don't know how many thousands or millions of different chemical processes happening at the same time. And they all have to be balanced with each other in perfect balance and harmony and interacting with each other exactly right. And the timing has to be right in order for that cell to be alive. And then in our bodies, we have skin cells and we have nerve cells and brain cells and muscle cells and blood cells and connective tissue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many different systems. We have the circulation system, the digestive system, and the respiratory system, and so many different things happening in the body at the same time. For all of that to be able to work, it's like, it's not, the question shouldn't ever be, obviously it makes sense to ask if someone's unwell or having a medical issue, you ask, why would this issue, what's the cause of the issue? Because we want to have the issue resolved. But the real question is, how could it even be possible for a person to be alive and healthy for a second? Just the number of things that have to be working at so many levels perfectly is insane. There's no way to think, to even grasp how much is going on with such precision, right? And that's why, if a person has a complex medical situation, they go to one specialist and they'll tell them one thing, you go to another specialist and they tell them something else. Why? Because each doctor, each specialized doctor is looking at things in the context of their field of medicine. And in the context of their field of medicine, they see things a certain way. And then you ask someone who specializes in a different field of medicine, and they see things in the context of their field of medicine, because there are so many different systems in the body, and each one is already its own world for itself. And then all of them have to work together. It's crazy. So yeah, blessed is Hashem, God who does wonders. The wonder of life and the wonder of a human being being able to be alive and healthy is just, it's wondrous. It's crazy to imagine, to try and get a grip on what's going on, and it has to come together perfectly for this to happen. But then there's another layer of meaning also when we say that Hashem does wonders in terms of us being alive. There's the additional layer, the additional wondrous or unnatural layer, which is the fact that we, by definition, are a combination of body and soul. And a body and soul should not be able to interact, because a soul doesn't physically exist and a body doesn't spiritually exist. How is it possible for two things? Yeah. Depending on what you mean by that. A body isn't made out of spirit. A body is made out of flesh and bones. It's made out of atoms. It's made out of physical mass and energy. Right? And what an angel is made out of is not physical, it's spiritual. So in the world of the angel, the person is like, a person is to an angel like an angel is to a person, roughly. In terms of, it's something that we know angels exist and that this abstract entity that exists in a different layer of reality, but they don't physically exist. They're not made out of physical mass and energy. And the same is true in the reverse. So how does a body that doesn't spiritually exist and a soul that doesn't physically exist partner and interact together and work together as a team, which every single one of us is a living example of that? And the answer is, it's actually not naturally possible. And that's something that God makes happen unnaturally, because God is creating the interpreter. Each of us is the facilitator of interaction between physical and spiritual. So God makes in every single one of us an instance of an unnatural union of matter and spirit, so that we can then facilitate further communication and coming together of matter and spirit, of physical and spiritual. You have a question?
Yeah, so aren't angels more aware of us than them, because they're an intermediary between Hashem and us?
It's a good question.
I think, yeah, because the world was made for the purpose of this world. They're more like tools. We are not tools. We are the purpose of creation.
I mean that they're spiritually superior to us. So.
I would say they're more spiritually in tune for sure. And they're, in terms of their experience and awareness and consciousness, they're closer to Hashem than we are. Are they more aware of us? It's a good question. I don't know that we necessarily know that they are. I think it's fair to say that they definitely have a higher level of awareness and consciousness, so maybe yes. But we also know about them. We know about them, but we can't really sort of relate to what they are, right? We know that they're this thing that exists, but it's not physical. And to them, in a sense, we are this thing that exists that's not spiritual, the human body at least.
Their realm, like the realm of angels, would maybe be able to see us in our physical world.
I don't know that that's necessarily presumed to be the case. Because it is sequential, but they are separate layers. And that which defines each layer is different. I would say it's probably a bit of both. I'm thinking out loud now. Because like you said, they definitely have a higher level of awareness than we do, and a greater awareness of the big picture. And if we're part of the picture, maybe part of that is that they have a greater awareness of us. Perhaps.
like when we call to them during davening, I'm wondering like if they don't have like human senses, like vision or.
We're generally mostly not calling to them during davening so much as describing them. Are you talking about like the brachas before Shema? We say Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodesh. So at that point, we're not actually calling out to the angels. We're describing what happens with the angels.
What about during Shabbos? Like,
Shalom Aleichem. Yes, so that's different. That would be a form of interaction with the angels.
I just wonder like how they relate to us. If it's like if they're present in the world, but this isn't their world too. Like.
It's a good question. And it's look. Avraham had malachim, had angels who visited him in last week's parsha, right? So. But then when it says that Avram fed the angels and they ate, there's a lot of discussion in the commentaries. Did they actually eat, or did they just sort of make it look like they were eating? Because they're not physical. They don't have digestive systems to eat. The whole thing was kind of almost like an illusion. Now, not an illusion per se, but it was this sort of physical manifestation of a non-physical entity. So the whole physical aspect was kind of just a cover and a front, but they were never physical entities per se. So there is definitely some degree of interaction, and there are stories of of angels coming and interacting in the world. Those stories are unique and specific and limited. It's a good question. When we say Shalom Aleichem, and I'm not sure whether there's an answer to this, maybe I should be. Are we welcoming them in the sense that they consciously hear us? Or perhaps what we're doing is putting the welcome out there and it reaches them and affects them, but without them necessarily being consciously aware of what it is. I don't know. Because both of them could kind of fit the description of welcoming them, right?
Also, like presupposing that they have this human thing called the conscience.
Right.
Okay,
Correct.
I don't mean to stop you.
No, I love it, and I would love. This is going deeper into these things is like my favorite pastime, literally. But we're never going to finish this. It's a good question, and I think it's probably fair to suggest that they have some degree of consciousness, but what it is probably very different to what we know as consciousness. So, yeah. Okay, so ultimately, right, we are here to be the facilitator of the union between matter and spirit, of basically ultimately bringing divinity into the fabric of a physical world. And we do that. Okay, so before we do that, now, there are going to be two directions in terms of bringing two things together, right? Let's go back to the metaphor of the business. If you want to create a successful partnership or business relationship between an American company and a Vietnamese company, and first of all, there's the language barrier, and let's assume that even once you overcome the language barrier, there might be some cultural differences between them. And even if not, anytime you want to get any two companies to partner or work together, the two companies are two separate companies because they have two separate objectives. They're not one company, they're two companies. Each one has its own interests and its own objectives. And if you want to ultimately create a successful partnership or interaction or relationship between them, like in any relationship, you've got to figure out how to bring the two closer to each other. Now, hypothetically, ideally, each business would like the other business to come all the way to them, but that's never the way that things work in reality, right? We have to come mutually closer to each other. And the exact amount of give and take can vary, but in any successful relationship, there is a movement on the part of both entities in the relationship towards each other. A relationship in which one entity moves towards the other and there's no reciprocal movement back is not going to be healthy or stable or likely to have any sort of longevity. And if it does have longevity and it continues to maintain that status, it'll probably just continue to deteriorate. So if we get to have this relationship and interaction between physical and spiritual, it's also going to have two directions of movement. So there's a metaphor that's given in the Medrash for when Hashem gave the Torah, why Hashem gave the Torah, or what happened when Hashem gave us the Torah in Mount Sinai, particularly considering the fact that there was already Torah study before and there was already observance of mitzvahs before. So what changed when Hashem gave the Torah? And the answer is, the Medrash says that, gives a metaphor of two cities, and the king decreed that the residents of the two cities are not allowed to travel between the cities. Everyone has to stay in their own city. There's no travel back and forth. And that was like kind of the way things were. The physical is physical, the spiritual is spiritual, and there's no ability for them to interact with each other. Then in the metaphor, it says, then the king abolishes this decree and says, from now on, the residents of the two cities can travel back and forth, interact, do this, whatever you want. And so when Hashem gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, on Har Sinai, what changed was that now there was this ability for physical and spiritual to interact. Not because it became a now naturally feasible phenomenon, it was still unnatural, but now Hashem gave us the Torah, and Hashem said, I'm commanding you to do this. When we do it with Hashem's strength, Hashem has the ability to override the rules, because Hashem's the one who made the rules in the first place. Hashem's the one who created physical and spiritual in a way that they don't interact with each other, so he can override those rules if he wants. And so in the Medrash, what it says is that, so the same way that the king said residents of this city can go to that city and residents of that city can go to that city, so in the actual original thing that it's a metaphor for, Hashem says, when Hashem gave the Torah, he said, Tachtonim Yalalel, which one's first? I think first, El Yonim Yerdala Tachtonim, that which is above can now descend below. The spiritual can descend to the physical. But Tachtonim Yalala El Yonim, and the physical can ascend to the spiritual. Va'ani Hamaschil, and then it says, and Hashem says, I'm going to start. As it says, and Hashem descended on Har Sinai. It's kind of like, if you bring out a cake for dessert, if you're hosting people, nobody wants to cut the cake, right? So what do? You have to cut the cake and take a piece out. Either take it for yourself, or sometimes what happens is you go to an event and the caterer actually will remove a slice from the platter before the event starts so that everybody feels comfortable, because no one feels like they're taking the first slice. So it's kind of the same thing. Hashem's like, okay, we've had a world for 2,000 years. There's been no interaction between physical and spiritual. It's allowed. Let's go for it. Okay, you know what? I'll start. I'll do the first one. So Hashem descended on Har Sinai. Hashem, allowed his spiritual presence to enter into the physical reality, which was the icebreaker for the interaction between physical and spiritual. And ever since then, whenever we learn Torah and do mitzvahs, we are bringing physical and spiritual together. But again, the directions of movement in terms of us are different. Torah study is bringing divinity into ourselves. Mitzvahs is going outwards, is bringing the divinity into the world around us. And ultimately, the reason that the world exists is for us to bring divinity into the world around us. Now, there are there are roles. There's a role in society for everyone. There's a role in society for people who focus on Torah study and extreme personal development, and the community needs those people. And there's a role in the community for people who are really focused on the mitzvahs and the outgoing and bringing divinity into the world. And naturally, a lot of us are going to tend more to one than the other.
People immerse in the mikvah before they receive the Torah.
Yes. The Gemara actually says that we all went to the mikvah before the Torah was given.
So you know how a few parshas ago we were talking about circumcision as like the ultimate bridging of the two, because it's like a permanent change. I wonder why mikvah wasn't one of them for like the mitzvah, because when you're immersed, like also like your hair absorbs the water and everything, so it's like, I guess it's
okay, good. So I want to clarify the bris thing a little, the circumcision thing a little, because it's what you're saying is very true. The reason that the bris was chosen was not because it's the unification of physical and spiritual to a greater degree. It's just because it expresses it more, because you actually see a physical change in the body. That's the only mitzvah where there's a visible physical impact in the body, which is an illustration to us of the extent of the impact of every mitzvah on the physical. Right? So what you're saying about mikveh is true, but you don't see a difference on someone when they come out of the mikveh relative to when they went in. The difference is there, but you don't see it. The idea of the bris is that it's an illustration, right, of the impact of a mitzvah on a physical body in a very tangible and visible way.
I wonder why there's no equivalent for women, like not in circumcision, but
Yeah,
a different type of thing that's like altering the body in like a permanent way.
it's a good question. Perhaps, I guess, just to really get into what's going on there, perhaps every mitzvah has an impact on the body. All we need is some sort, and the fact that the mitzvah of bris physically alters the body, it doesn't say anywhere that means that mitzvah impacts the body any more than any other mitzvah. It's just that it's more visible. So it's just that for our sake, there is a visible example of the fact that a mitzvah impacts the body. So it doesn't really matter who it is, right? If we would say that mitzvah has a real impact on the body in a different way to other mitzvahs, then that would be a really important question. But that's not, it's ultimately just about the visible expression of it, the fact that we see it. It's not, the point is not that mitzvah has more of an impact on the body than another mitzvah. It's just that they're like, you see it. So that's the one example of where it's like, oh, wow, mitzvahs really change the body. When actually every mitzvah does. Does that make sense? Okay. So now, as usual, we're going to have to tie up like the last 2/3 of this in 5 minutes, because that's what we do in my class and always have. So, right, there's the fact that Avram and Sarah were tzaddikim, they were righteous. But a person can be righteous and just focus on Torah study. A person can, and obviously there are mitzvahs that we need to do, but a person can be righteous and focus primarily on Torah study. A person can be righteous and focus primarily on mitzvahs. And Avram really, really maxed out both. He was Zokin and Bar Bayomim. Avram Zokin, Bar Bayomim. Avram with both Zeshe Kona Chachma, he both excelled and maxed out Torah study, and Bar Bayomim filled the days. Days are time. Days are a part of that which defines our physical experiential reality. It's the passage of time. It's very tangible. It's very much a part of the physical reality that we experience. And Avram managed through his mitzvahs, through his interactions with the world, to bring divinity and to bring godliness all the way down into time itself, into the fabric of physical existence itself. And so this is what Tamimi means, complete. Avraham and Sarah were both complete in the sense that they maxed out both. It's two different directions and two different emphases. The emphasis of Torah is spiritual, intangible. The focus of mitzvahs is tangible. The direction of Torah is inwards. The direction of mitzvahs is outwards. Avram and Sarah maxed out both categories. They were Zokain, maxed out Torah study and the inward movement of divinity into themselves, and Bar Bayomim coming into the days, bringing that divinity into the days, into the fabric of the world, into the fabric of existence. So that's complete. And now, and that's unique, right? So they weren't just righteous, right? We asked, if they were righteous, why does it have to say that they were complete? The answer is that a person can be righteous without having this degree of completion across both oppositely trending categories of Torah and mitzvahs, or oppositely directed categories.
So they're like the Hezbollah.
Sorry?
They're like the Hezbollah.
Yes, right. They're the esrog of Torah and mitzvahs, correct. So that's what complete means. And now it also makes sense, just like they were complete, just like they maxed out both their Torah. And at the same time as they maxed out their relationship with the spiritual and the inward movement of that spirituality into themselves, they were also, Bar Bayomim, they also really maxed out the bringing of that, of their own divinity and spirituality out into the world, to the extent they brought it all the way down to the fabric of existence itself, into the days, into the time. It makes sense now that that's going to be reflected and reciprocated in them living out the fully allotted amount of time, because this is about the extent to which they brought divinity out of themselves towards the world was such that it went all the way down into the fabric of time itself. They infused time itself with divinity, with godliness. Ba bayamim, they came into the days and they brought divinity into time itself through their mitzvahs, through their acting on the world and in the world. And that, again, that's illustrated and emphasized by the fact that they brought it all the way into the fabric of time. Then it makes sense that in terms of their own lives, they're going to live out their fully allotted amount of time. There's a very, once we understand what tamimim, what this completeness is, it makes a lot of sense that kashem shahem tamimim, that the fact that they are complete is going to be reflected in the completeness of their personal experience in terms of time, because that completeness is expressed in the fact that they had a complete both inward movement of spirituality and then an outward movement of that into the tangible world, all the way down into the fabric of time itself. Make sense? Okay, and we actually finishing on time. How about that? It's definitely the first time I've finished on time this year, possibly the second or third time I've ever finished a class on time in my career of teaching at this school.
So why was Sarah chosen?
Sorry? I did?
Yeah.
Just joking.
So why was Sarah chosen to be the, like, out of all the Zalikim that we have?